Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. Place your bets. It's Election Day. In New Jersey and Virginia, voters are choosing their governor. In a remote corner of New York State, a congressional race has captured the attention of political professionals across the country. Joining me to discuss all of this is Washington Post columnist Dana Milbank and CBS News political analyst Marc Ambinder. Marc, I'm going to start with you. Yep. What one thing are you looking for, well, if there is just one, out of the results tonight?
Looking for a lot of different things, but I'd say I'm looking to see if Jon Corzine, the governor of New Jersey, is reelected. The president has spent a lot of time there. He's spent a lot of time in the White House recording robocalls that specifically aimed at his voters in New Jersey. And this is kind of the one race where he's really invested a lot of himself in. So if, I hate to use the word referendum because it's the word that everyone's talking about, when there actually are referendums in other states that are going to matter, but if this is a referendum on President Obama, then if Jon Corzine is soundly defeated in New Jersey, it's the one race I think that's going to reflect negatively on the president. So that's what I'll be looking for primarily.
And the polls there are pretty much
dead
even.
Yeah.
Dana, you wrote today about whether this is a referendum on President Obama. A, give me your guess on that, and B, talk a little bit about the gamesmanship.
Well, of course it's a referendum because we're all going to sit here and say it's a referendum one way or the other.
Like 4-syllable words.
It's very difficult. I just called it the R word in there just to simplify. Or you could call it a plebiscite, which would be only 3 syllables, which would be better. But you know, we're always looking for a storyline here, and let's face it, these are kind of random contests. Upstate New York, New Jersey, Virginia. There's always an element of the president's popularity in any race. It's probably not the dominant factor in any of these races, but I think as Marc was saying, if everything goes one way, we're going to be more inclined, you know, or if for some reason somehow Creed Deeds in Virginia can pull it out, well, that looks really good for Obama at this point because everybody expects him to lose. So it's just the expectations game.
Right. Marc, let's just talk about Virginia quickly. Bob McDonnell, if he wins, and we're going to do a lot of ifs here just so let's, if he wins, is he the new model of the Republican kind of outside of Washington kind of candidate? Does he become the hot conversation in terms of where this party, which is trying to figure itself out, is going? Or is it just a guy who wins in Virginia and then they move on?
Well, look, Creed Deeds a really smart guy who is turned out to be a very bad candidate. So you don't want to over-attribute Bob McDonnell's expected win to Bob McDonnell. But what Bob McDonnell did do was, in some sense, walk away from the Bob McDonnell that Virginians knew in past elections and walked into a different model of candidate who ran on jobs, who ran on bipartisan cooperation, who ran on improving education and infrastructure, in many ways like a centrist Democrat. So what you're going to see, I think, is people say, look, for conservative Republicans who have enough credentials with their own base, they can run like Bob McDonnell ran and get the type of independence that Republicans haven't been getting. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, but I think you're going to hear a lot of that.
Dana, in the last election, 2008, Virginia was a big deal. It was, you know, President Obama, then Senator Obama won in Virginia. It was a big switch. Why isn't that? Why shouldn't we all, leaving aside the fact we all need a story tomorrow, why shouldn't we be, you know, putting a lot of into this race?
Well, I mean, I think we are. It's just that because it's already baked into the cake, everybody's assuming that Creed Deeds is lost and Obama's sort of taken the hit. They've been, the White House has been inoculating him for a couple of weeks, sort of leaking word that, well, they didn't really follow our advice, and it's really all his fault. There was perhaps an overreaction last year saying Virginia had gone blue. That was perhaps a bit premature. This is still a battleground, and I don't always agree with Robert Gibbs when he says this is really quite a purple state, and that's how it's going to stay for a while.
Marc, let's talk about New York 23. This is the northernmost district in New York State. Exciting change over the weekend where Didi Scozzafava dropped out, the moderate Republican. She's now thrown her support to the Democrat. What do you think will happen? And then let's start talking about how each side in the Republican field is going to claim some kind of victory out of this election.
Well, it looks like the non-Republican conservative candidate, Doug Hoffman, is going to win and probably would caucus with, will almost certainly caucus with Republicans. Republicans will take it as a victory. But it's just a special election, of course, because it's filling an empty seat, but it's a special district. It's the whitest district east of the Mississippi. It's the largest district in terms of geography and land area. It's gone Republican, I think, every term since this, every seat in Civil War has been occupied by a Republican. So it's not a district Democrat necessarily has a chance to win. What essentially happened here was the party leaders chose Dee. I'll just used to say Dee Dee. Chose Dee Dee. That's how she refers to herself. So I'm not being sexist. But they chose Dee Dee, which angered a lot of the conservative activists in the state, including a guy named Doug Hoffman, who had played some little role in politics, not really. He ran on the third party in New York on the Conservative Party ticket, which you can do in New York fairly easily. And there was sort of a mutual arrangement where conservative activists outside the district kind of hijacked the race, and Hoffman let it be hijacked because he got millions and millions of dollars. 95% of his money comes from outside the district in order to sort of let the race be used as a way to send a message to a variety of different constituents, to the NRCC, the party campaigns in Washington, to Democrats in Congress who are fed up with it. So, you got to look at the race in terms of how it evolved as opposed to it being necessarily an organic reflection of anger, I think.
Dana, what do you think, though, of the fact that basically every Republican has had to take a position on this race? It split things down the middle. In terms of your role as an anthropologist of these movements, how do you think this will play out in the infighting that's going on in the Republican Party?
I think that's what it's all about. I think, in a way, who cares what this particular district in upstate New York is about? I'm sure that people are very nice there, but this is really about the soul of the Republican Party, and it fits the storyline that we saw in Pennsylvania with Arlen Specter, and sort of it's not the Republican Party anymore. It's the Club for Growth and the Republican Study Committee. It's become a very conservative operation, and whatever happens in the election today, this is a triumph for the conservatives within the Republican Party. Others around the nation are going to draw a lesson from this race, regardless that conservatism is the way to go. That may be a mistake.
And you have to, it seems to me, if you're a Republican in all of these litmus test moments, you have to weigh in. Yeah. I mean, they're all now, Fred Thompson weighed in, and Sarah Palin, and Pawlenty, and Newt Gingrich weighed in, and so it seems like everybody lines up and will continue on each of these litmus tests as they try to figure themselves out. Let's talk now about an anniversary here. If this may or may not be a referendum on the president, we are at the anniversary of his election last year. I was struck watching some of the clips from this HBO documentary on the campaign that will be shown tonight that we're just a long way away in Washington from the euphoria of last year in his election. I'll start with you, Dana, just in terms of a year ago when there seemed so much promise and change behind his presidency. Now his White House, the president's White House, seems pretty much like a White House would be. I mean, it doesn't seem radically different.
It does. I mean, things have come down to earth, but I mean, you could look back at the year and say it's been enormously successful. I mean, the man won a Nobel Prize by virtue of not being George W. Bush, and throughout the government, things have changed in meaningful but subtle ways. I think where he's been a disappointment is just against the unrealistic expectations that everybody assumed by now that the economy would be roaring along, we'd have no more wars, we'd have healthcare solved, we'd have climate change solved, and those things they're heading in the direction the president wants them to head in, but this is Washington. This is the city of stasis. This is not a city of change.
But fair enough, though he did run as the guy who would change that phenomenon. Right. I mean, isn't that...
The point of that, I think, is that he is responsible for setting some of these, as he said during his campaign and is in the clip of that movie, we are the ones we've been waiting for. He's responsible for setting a lot of those expectations. I think the other thing is, it is really hard for a majority president with a majority Congress to govern in Washington when you have to get 60 votes in the Senate, and when you have a minority party that is going to do everything to frustrate, that's going to do everything to frustrate the will of the majority, and that's the way politics works. And yet, at the same time, I think what that's done is it's made a lot of his victories, turned them from being complete victories to partial victories, which means that Democrats aren't terribly enthusiastic about them. And look, the economy's condition is, when it comes to any force in politics, economic discontent is the most powerful force in politics. And right now, conservatives are using it to their advantage politically, and you're probably going to see that in 2010. The Obama administration's argument is, well, look, we saved the economy. Probably true, but it doesn't redound to their benefit. He's not getting credit for that. So he has to come up with another argument where he has to create jobs. And it may be unfair to say that to him, but that's the reality I think he finds himself in.
All right, so let me get into the predictions on the way out here, Dana. What will you be writing after tonight?
Well, I'm writing today about the now famous boycott of the markup of the climate change legislation. So I'm pretty much full-time looking at the missing in action Republican Party, part of the obstruction you were just referring to.
Where do you think, Marc, you'll be at the end of this evening? You'll be, what you'll be writing about these results?
I'm going to try and look at how every side spins it and try and qualify their spin a little bit to try and bring them down to reality. I don't know if that's going to make me terribly popular, but that's what I tend to do on election nights. I tend to say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, and you got to listen to me.
Well, hopefully they'll give us lots of opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I think they will.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, Dana. Finally, Bob Schieffer sat down with Washington Post Pentagon reporter Greg Jaffe to discuss his new book, The Fourth Star: Four Generals in the Epic Struggle for the Future of the United States Army. Take a look.
Greg Jaffe is the Pentagon correspondent for the Washington Post, and his book is The Fourth Star, which tells the story of the modern U.S. Army through the lives of four of our most famous generals, who are
John Abizaid, David Petraeus, Pete Corelli, and George Casey.
And you go through the lives and careers of these generals to just try to give us a portrait of where the Army is today. And I must say this is a timely time to be thinking about that, because with the strain on the U.S. Army now, it seems to me that that the president is going to have to make some hard decisions here pretty quick about how much of an army can we maintain. Is the army that we have now going to be sufficient for the mission that may be ahead?
Yeah, no, and George Casey, who's Chief of Staff of the Army, Pete Corelli, who's the Vice Chief, are at the center of that decision with regard to the health of the Army. Dave Petraeus right now is on the other end. He's the head of U.S. Central Command. He's the guy who's using the force up.
So how would you describe the situation in Afghanistan right now? Because obviously that's the one thing that's on the front runner now.
I mean, the big thing, I think the big question for the military is whether you can apply some of the lessons from Iraq, really hard lessons learned over the course of 7 or 8 years, and whether they apply to Afghanistan, particularly this notion that really took hold in Iraq, largely because of General Petraeus, of population-based counterinsurgency, the notion you can protect the people, and if you do that, then good things will follow. The question is whether that applies to a place like Afghanistan, which the people are a little harder to protect. They're not clustered in big cities. They're spread out in rural areas. It's a much more foreign culture. As foreign as Iraq was, Afghanistan may be an even more foreign culture.
It's also a country that it seems to me we're trying to create a central government there, and it's been few and far between the central governments that we've had in Afghanistan over the centuries.
Well, and one of the lessons that I think General Petraeus picks up and applies to Iraq that now we're going to have to see if it works in Afghanistan is that counterinsurgency is not about firepower, it's about governance and economics and politics and culture. So we succeeded in Iraq largely because we were able to build a government that, while far from perfect, is at least marginally sort of representative. Iraqis see as marginally representative. You're right, I think it's a much bigger challenge to do the same thing in Afghanistan, which doesn't have sort of a culture of central governance.
And the other part is, and this hasn't been talked about all that much, but the thought occurs to me, if we do put 40,000 troops into Afghanistan, as General McChrystal, the commander on the ground, wants to do, can we in fact afford that? I'm told that it's now $250,000 a troop to keep one troop on the ground in Afghanistan for a year. That means that's what, $10 billion a year to put 40,000 troops in there?
You know, and I would say the cost, then the long-term cost is potentially higher than the near-term cost. You know, what happens in Vietnam is the strain on the force there drives your sergeants and captains, you know, the guys who lead on the ground, out of the service. And it takes a good decade for the Army to rebound from that. And actually, the interesting part is the four guys we write about, they all joined the Army between 1970 and 74. They joined the Army at its absolute lowest. So all these four-stars who are now running the Army, worried about the thing that you just mentioned, you know, the strain on the force. You know, they know what it's like. They know what it's like to be in a broken Army, particularly General Casey.
Colin Powell said the other day that when we talk about sending more troops to Afghanistan, he said what we should be saying is talking about sending the same troops to Afghanistan. And he's talking about the strain on these soldiers, some of whom have now been deployed 3 times to Iraq, and you're talking about a 4th deployment. We're seeing this, the result of this in the numbers of these kids with the battle syndrome, post-battle stress, and all of that, plus the other stresses that are on them. Is our Army going to be able to survive this?
You know, the one thing the Army has shown so far that's been surprising is that it's amazingly resilient. And I think you could almost argue that in some cases we get ourselves into trouble in Iraq by worrying a little bit too much about the strength of the force. I think General Casey in particular, he's reluctant. The whole time he's in Iraq as the senior commander there, I think he's trying to fight the war, and he's also trying to protect this Army that he sort of loves dearly. And the two really, the two at their heart are kind of contradictions, and I think it hinders his effectiveness. So there's an interesting tension. I mean, I think General Petraeus and General McChrystal, by their nature, have to be greedy. They have to ask for everything they need and more. And the folks back here have to worry about, General Casey and General Corelli have to worry about the health of this force. What
is the thing that surprised you most as you did your research for this book? And what do you think is how would you evaluate our Army now at this point?
You know, they're similar answers to both. I think the thing that surprised me most is we have this notion that 4-star generals kind of fall from the sky fully formed. How these guys behave in Iraq is very much a byproduct of sort of the unique experiences they have growing up in the Army. Their ability to think unconventionally. For General Petraeus and General Corelli, both of them go to civilian graduate school. They spent some time in this little tribe of the Army called the Social Sciences Department, which is this sort of font of new ideas. It's a place where sort of generals, produces a lot of generals, it also produces a lot of dissidents. So it's an interesting combination. These guys sort of grow up in there, and it allows them to see the fight in Iraq and to a certain extent in Afghanistan differently than their peers. That's one thing that's really surprised me. The other thing in terms with regard to the state of our Army, which is similar, is if you look at the Army in 2009, I think this drove a lot of our thinking in the book, it's almost unrecognizable compared with the Army of 2003. How officers see the world and understand warfare has completely changed, largely as a result, I think, of generals like Petraeus and Corelli. You know, war's not about firepower anymore. It's not about tanks and guns. It's about politics, economics, governance, religion.
Greg Jaffe. And the name of the book is The Four-Star Generals and the Epic Struggle for the Future of the United States Army. Fascinating. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for watching Washington Unplugged. Find us here every day at cbsnews.com at 12:30. I'm John Dickerson. Have a great election day.